How many people, just out of interest quickly, were in my talk yesterday on geolocation? Okay, you might hear some of the same jokes. Everyone else, we're good. I'm from Australia. One of the speakers that's come across the ditch. I've presented there for a number of years, but this is my first year at TechEd New Zealand. And I was warned by one of the other Australian presenters that you don't score as well and that you're quite a hostile audience. But I feel that we can be friends. And I said that to the guys yesterday, and everything worked out okay. And then what I actually found out was the scoring system here is completely different. So the other guy just can't do maths. Today we're going to be going through Internet Explorer 9. Now we're going to be doing this with a developer focus, which is why we're looking at IE 9. You'll see all the IT pro guys. They have a session on how to migrate from IE 6. We're not really worried about that. What is Internet Explorer 9? This is Microsoft's next big standards release of the browser. It's about HTML5, it's about CSS3, and it's about SVG 1.1. So there's 3 big standards in there, but then there's a whole bunch of other cleanup and improvements that have gone along the way. So today, I'm going to take you through a tour of some of what's new in each of these areas, and also touch on how can we use some of these new features and these new standards in a way that interoperates with other browsers, what's supported across the whole marketplace, as well as interoperating with previous versions of Internet Explorer. So that whole progressive enhancement idea. So what is HTML5? HTML5 is this wonderful brand that now gets thrown around. At its core, it's about a couple of things. The first one is we've got a new doc type. Now, it sounds kind of boring, but it's actually pretty cool, I think. Browsers have always rendered, well, in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, you've had your quirks mode and your standards mode rendering, and they get triggered based on putting the appropriate doc type at the top. But the doc type's like this 200-character thing that nobody can ever remember, and you have to have IntelliSense for it to generate the thing and whatever. HTML5, it's now really nice and simple. You can remember it off the top of your head. I'm going to type it every single one of my demos here today because I don't need to copy and paste it at last. And that's actually pretty critical for standards adoption. More interesting, though, we've got new structural elements. Rather than just wrapping div and span around everything, we now have things like nav to represent a navigational area. We have section, article, headers, so all the various heading levels, 1 through 6, can actually be bound to a particular section of the page, so you can start to describe the structure a lot better. Things like banner, header, footer. And this allows us to, A, have a lot more elements that we can use to more appropriately mark up our content, so we can target styling and whatnot easier without putting class names everywhere. But it also actually makes our pages more accessible and searchable and so on. So I'll look at some of that. One of the big things that's been discussed is obviously the media elements. In particular, the video tag has been quite a debate. But the simple version is we don't need to go and use Flash to play video in all our web pages anymore. Of course, you can use Silverlight for other things like smooth streaming. But if all you want to do is put a video on your web page and play it in the browser somehow, we've now got a video tag that does that. There's also an audio tag which allows you to go and put MP3 files and WAV files and so on in. So great for like if you've got a podcasting site or something like that. With all of these new tags, though, they've also defined a whole series of new parsing rules. One of the things that's really critical to understand about HTML5, this is not the death of XHTML. A lot of people are running around saying, oh, XHTML is dead, it's all HTML5. The XHTML working group's been disbanded. They have been disbanded, but that's because they completed their charter. HTML5 as a standard defines 2 different serialization modes. It defines an SGML style serialization with a lot of very specific parsing rules and an XML serialization. So we'll look at a little bit of that and how that actually affects us as developers. And there's also a bunch of new APIs. HTML5 as a spec actually defines a whole bunch of JavaScript APIs for things like drag-drop, defines caching APIs for offline web applications. So it's actually a lot more than just a markup language. One of the interesting things about it, though, is basically everything that's new in the browser world at the moment, people just call it HTML5 anyway. So the talk I did yesterday on geolocation, I was talking about a particular JavaScript API. It is its own standard. It has nothing to do with HTML5. But people refer to it as just being part of HTML5. So really anything that's new and hip and sexy, just call it HTML5 and people know what you're talking about. So let's jump into some code. It's nice and early in the morning. I'm going to go through a bunch of demos of some of what's new in CSS3. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually using Visual Studio for these. All the code that I'm going to be writing here is all client-side code, just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But I use Visual Studio because I really like it as an editor. And I'm going to just drop in my first template file. Now, the build of Internet Explorer that I'm using here today is what's called a platform preview build. You can go and download this publicly off the Microsoft website, there's a couple of things you'll notice about it. First of all, it doesn't have a toolbar, it doesn't have an address bar, it doesn't have a lot of stuff. All that this is a really simple wrapper on top of the rendering engine and the JavaScript engine so that we can get the developer experience. You'll notice things like, even if I go and navigate to a page, and I go right click, even back doesn't work on the context because there's no navigation component plugged into the browser. So it's this whole, it's almost like driving a screen reader. There's about 15 different key commands to actually make it do something. But, so what I'm going to do is just grab this file, open it up here, and we've got a pretty simple layout there. So we've got a div with, I swear I haven't done this talk at another conference with an entirely different name. We'll just put TechEd in there quickly. So this is all pretty stock standard. So the next thing I'm going to do though is on top of the div here, I'm going to change the position to absolute. So this will place it on top of the other piece of text there. Pretty simple, all quite normal. The next thing I'm going to do though is then actually set a background color on this of something like red. Now we can see here that it's gone and masked out the underlying element. What we've always been able to do, but is not very common, is actually also specify this in RGB. So I can specify that as out of 255, the 3 color components, and I get the same value here. What's cool in CSS3 is I can put another component on the end, and I can do an RGBA value. So the last value on the end there is an alpha value, and what I'm actually doing is setting the opacity of that color. So you can see here now that we get the word CSS coming through that background color. If I zoom in a bit more, and I'll zoom in with the OS as well, you'll see this is different to me setting the opacity on the element because the text within the element that says TechEd is still solid black. So I find that kind of interesting, RGBA. What we can also do though, everybody loves all their rounded corners. We've got another new property, border radius. I can go and set this to 20 pixels and instantly we get rounded corners on our border as well. So really simple CSS stuff. One point to note here about the difference between opacity and alpha. Alpha is a lot more performant if you're going to use it. If all you want to do is just put some sort of, translucent cover over something or whatever, use an RGBA value because the browser can render that straight onto the actual rendering surface. If you use opacity, it has to render that element off screen because it might contain things like, say, a text box or a button or something, which it also has to affect the opacity of. So it has to render it off screen and then copy it on really slow. All right, so that's quite a simple example. Let's move on to something more interesting in the way of selectors. So being I like to think I'm a decent web developer. I'm building a menu here, so I've gone and used an unordered list, nice semantic structure for it. And I want to go and style this up a bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is we'll get rid of the list style. So we lose the bullet points. We can get rid of some of the margins and the padding so it sits back a bit. And then I'm just going to set a border on each of the menu items. All right, so we're starting to get a bit of a menu here, but we can clean this up a bit. If I jump in, and I'm now actually going to put a border radius on this, we can get rather than just setting one value, we can go clockwise around from the top. So I'm going to say 20 pixels, 0, 0. So now we've just got rounded corners on the tops of each of them. But what I actually want to do is kind of make this sort of rounded corners on the top, nice square boxes, then rounded corners on the bottom. So normally what we'd do is we'd somehow, either just through our static code or server side, we'd go and put like a class first or something like that. But now we're starting to affect our markup purely for the sake of styling, which kind of defeats the point of CSS to an extent. What I can do now, using a new selector type, is actually say nth of type. So now I can just apply that border radius to the first element of that type. Kind of useful. And then obviously there's an equivalent nth last of type, and we can go and swap those values around. So there we go, we get a nice little stacked menu thing, quite easily. Would have been hard to do before. So how does this work across the browsers? This is CSS3. It's perfectly standardized. This will work in Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and Internet Explorer 9. What happens in your other browsers? They just go and ignore this property. So if I copy this path, I can go and open up IE8. If I look at that, we just get the squares. Now, one thing that you, in web development, particularly if you're working with a designer who's sitting around in Photoshop doing everything pixel perfect, they'll expect everything to come out pixel perfect. The reality is the web doesn't actually need to be like that. In a lot of cases, it's probably sufficient that some of your users get this experience, and then as your users move up to newer browsers, you can start to sort of smooth up the interface a bit. So basically, this is more a graceful degradation type scenario. All right, third demo. So we've got 6 of these little CSS demos to get through. This one gets a little bit more interesting because we start to get some funky little equations. So here I've got a table. I've got 10 rows in it. And I'm just going to set a background color on each of these cells to a yellow. Nice and simple. Now the next thing I want to do is actually do candy striping on the rows, so highlight every alternate row. It's something that we do in a lot of our applications, particularly if you're dealing with data grids, and then you usually go right out alternate everywhere. What I can actually do is I can now say nth child. I'll make this a different background color. And then we parameterize this nth child like this. So what this is saying, the 2n plus 1, there's 2 parts to this. The first bit you need to look at is the plus 1. So it starts by moving down to the first element, so in this case the first tr that it finds, and then the 2 means it goes every second one after that. So if I did something like 2n plus 4, what it's going to do is just shift that down and only start from the 4th row. You can get a little bit funky with this as well. You can actually put some negative numbers in here. If I go negative n, it's going to go to the 4th element and then step 1 back every time. So you can actually highlight, say, your first 4 rows or your last 6 rows or whatever. So you can do some interesting stuff with this. Obviously, though, the maths can get a little bit annoying. So there's some nice little helpers where you can just say odd, or you can say even. And then we really don't need to care about how it all works too much. I was quite surprised that the negative thing worked, and that's not a browser bug, that's actually in the standard. So not entirely sure what scenarios they thought of when they made that one up, but somebody thought it was useful. All right, now the next demo here I sort of think of as akin to when WPF was launching and everybody had rotating text boxes everywhere. It's one of those things where it's kind of cool to say, oh look, the browser can do this, but then you sit back and think, do you really need to do that? When I go and highlight text here, I get blue background, white text. Browser choice, that's actually coming out of my Windows color set. There's a new pseudo class which I can use of pSelection, where I could actually go and say the background color is yellow, and we'll make the color black. So now I can even go and CSS style my highlight. The only things you can do here are the background color, the color of the text, or you can put an outline on it, an outline being distinct to a border and that it doesn't take up space in the layout, it doesn't reflow the document, and you can't set a background image on it. So it's quite restrictive, but it could be useful if there's a particular style that you're really, really trying to achieve. All right. So I mentioned there's some new parsing rules. Here we go. I remember to update this demo to have the correct conference name in it. HTML5 has a whole bunch of new elements, all the article section and so on. And rather than having to go and add explicit support to the browser for every single one of those elements through every single subsystem, one of the things they actually defined all the way back in the spec, and they said all the browser manufacturers have to do, is support any element anywhere in the DOM with all of the functionality you expect. So what I can actually do now is I can make up this arbitrary element, teched, and I can go and do something like, let's display that as a block level element, put a margin on it, and we can go and change the color. So now it's starting to behave like a paragraph tag. Now you don't really want to go making up your own elements all the time, but this here gives us a lot more extensibility moving forward. One of the things with HTML5, if you do want to start to adopt it, is particularly around IE6 support for it. IE6, if you go and put in, say, a section element, and then you apply some CSS to it, IE6 will just go, well, I don't know what this element is, so it doesn't apply the styling at all. Now, there's a particular JavaScript library you can use to hack around that, but now that we've got these parsing rules actually defined for all the browsers, it means we'll never get into that situation in the future. As we go and add new elements to the spec, you'll be able to adopt them in the other browsers a lot more quickly. All right, and then our final little CSS demo. We've obviously got more and more mobile devices around these days, and a lot of people are going and building mobile versions of their site. It works particularly nicely if you're using something like ASP.NET MVC. You can go and drop in new views and so on, but sometimes you don't really want to go to that much effort. You just want to tweak something a little bit. And particularly even for something like a netbook screen, you might want to give a slightly different experience to when I'm on my 27-inch LCD on my desk at home. So what I can do here is I'm going to, on this hello div, just set a background color, and we'll make this green. There we go. It's kind of unreadable now that it's green. And then the next thing I can do is actually use a media query. So I can go @media and say, until the maximum width of 600 pixels, I want to apply some different styling. So now I can go and say the background color is yellow, and then I'll do another one of these rules at 300 pixels where I'll make it red. So now, as I resize my browser, I get green, and then it goes to yellow, and then it goes to red. And I'm not even letting go of the mouse there, just as I move it, it's going and restyling the page. So how would this actually be useful? If we jump into, when you get the platform preview, it ships with a whole bunch of interesting examples in it. If we go into the media queries here, we can see one where there's a whole bunch of cool travel photos, optimized for a large screen. As we move in, it goes to something that's optimized for netbooks, so it's gone and got rid of the descriptions. And then as we move in even more, it gets to a point where it optimizes it for mobile. So it goes and removes the borders, reduces the spacing between the images and so on. So we're not building a whole different experience, we're just building an experience that's dynamic for the device that we're on. So I think that one was pretty cool. All right, rather than driving through lots and lots of these demos, what are some of the other things we can do? Basically, there's a whole bunch of new selectors. We've seen nth child, we've seen nth last child. Nth of type is basically the same as child, but you can, it's only for elements of that particular type. You can also go and say empty. So if you've got like a list or a table or something that's empty, you can style it differently. Form elements have a bunch of new pseudo classes applied to them. So checkboxes where they're enabled, input boxes where they're enabled or disabled. Checkboxes where they're checked or indeterminate. So they're in that grey state where they're not on or not off. And this is an interesting one. There's a pseudo class you can use of not, where you can then put another selector in it. So you do something like p:not brackets dot red. So it says find all of the p classes that don't have a class of red on them or something. Even the examples given in the spec for this are really wishy-washy and kind of useless. I'm yet to find an example that actually makes use of this other than just obfuscating what you write. So please don't use this. Or if you have a good example, come and tell me. What's the support for this? In Internet Explorer 9, if you go to css3.info and run the test there, all 41 selectors are supported across 574 tests. Obviously, the one that everybody cares about, though, is ACID 3. I've got Firefox 3.6, Chrome 5, and Safari on the end there. On the Internet Explorer front, we start all the way down at IE6. It scored a whopping 5 out of 100. Off to a good start. IE9, you can see even here it's pretty low. It was only about 30 when they first showed the preview at PDC, and they've been building up through each of the previews. Now, the previews have been released so far every 6 to 8 weeks. So that sort of gain on every 6 to 8 weeks is pretty impressive. You can see they've really got a focus on it. And it's currently sitting at 95 out of 100 in the latest preview release. All right, let's get on to the JavaScript front a little bit. There are two particular points which are interesting. One is that they've implemented add event listener properly. Now, most of you probably won't care because who writes JavaScript anymore? We all write jQuery, right? But this will go and improve a lot of those libraries. They have all this sort of switching under the covers of different ways to subscribe to events, and they're inconsistent event models of the way that they bubble and propagate. It's now all nice and consistent through IE. So those libraries will get simpler and faster. There's also support now natively for get elements by class name, which will also speed up your jQuery where you're using selectors to go and target particular elements. The big news, though, on the JavaScript front is actually there's a whole new JavaScript engine called Chakra. They've rewritten this from the ground up, basically. It does just-in-time compilation, the same as the .NET framework does. So when you go and hit a JavaScript method, it goes and takes that chunk of JavaScript, compiles it into native code, and then holds onto that. And when the page first loads, it also has a whole bunch of heuristics to go and detect what's the JavaScript that's likely to run soon and go and compile that. The other interesting change that they made in the latest build that only came out about 3 weeks ago, Preview 4, is the JavaScript engine, instead of being bolted onto the browser, is basically like a plugin, which is actually how Firefox works, because they want to be able to allow people to plug in different engines. It's now actually integrated into the browser, so a huge performance impact there as well. So let's have a look at some of that actually, some of the effects from that. Oop, that's the wrong browser, that's Chrome. Wrong talk. All right, so if we go home, this demo has a nice little warning on the bottom of it. This is the wonders of presenting a browser, is you're dependent upon conference internet half the time. So this has a nice photosensitive seizure warning, just for anybody in the room. This is going to demo a couple of things. Mainly it's actually going to show how fast Canvas is, but also in particular the JavaScript. What this demo here is doing is every single one of those pixels is being plotted via JavaScript onto a canvas, and then it's rotating that. So not only is the JavaScript insanely fast, but it's actually also doing all this through hardware acceleration, is something else you might have heard about IE9. So all of the graphics rendering is now hardware accelerated too. So we got 1835 revolutions per minute there. Does anybody want to choose a browser? Chrome, Firefox? Who do we want to pick on today? Chrome, all right. I was picking on Chrome in my talk yesterday. I was trying to show geolocation stuff and it kept crashing and failing. Slightly different experience, right? This is where JavaScript performance and also hardware acceleration actually kind of matter. So we'll close that before actually, where are we? And it's using 50% CPU, so it's using the entire core of my laptop. So let's close that before my laptop dies. So there's the performance stuff there. Leading on from the hardware acceleration I mentioned, obviously not every web page we build is gratuitous graphics getting rotated around. If we zoom right in on some of this text, so I'm doing Control+ there in the browser, and if I do Windows+ to zoom in, you'll see that the text is all nice and anti-aliased and perfectly crisp and so on. This is using the Direct 2D engine to actually write the text, whereas if we went to something like no, none of those. This is the problem when you have 4 different versions of Internet Explorer installed. People who are obviously web developers in the room, how many people actually have IE6 easily accessible on their machine? A few people. Okay. My background of what I do as a consultant is I work on lots of really large public websites in Australia, some of the really big share trading websites, e-commerce sites and so on. IE6 represents, for a lot of those, still a reasonable percentage of market share. On some of them it's as low as about 4%, some of the sites we work on it's as high as 17%. So we need to care. As a developer, I just like to have it handy anyway. You'll see that I've got this nice integrated experience of just being able to run it up. This is Windows 7, Windows Virtual XP mode, or Windows XP mode. So it's actually, you'll see down the bottom left there, I've got Chrome, IE8, IE6, IE9, all just on my taskbar, and I can just launch it as an app. And this isn't one of those dodgy hacks that have been installed in a funny way or anything. Whoop, we don't want to launch psychedelic browsing IE6. That's really not going to work. If we go and zoom in on the text here, you'll see it's absolutely hideous and ugly and whatnot. It gets a little bit better in IE8 because it has clear type, but it's still not as good as Direct 2D. So that's where hardware acceleration helps us out. All right, let's get back into some more code. SVG. SVG is scalable vector graphics. This is another standard that support's been added for Internet Explorer 9. And basically it's a way of representing graphics through markup, which you wonder why we want to do that, but let's have a look. So back into Visual Studio, I'm going to drop in my little template file. Oh, one thing I haven't pointed out yet, there's the doc type at the top for HTML5. Really short, easy to remember. Okay, so, yeah, they just kind of deleted about 80% of it. As long as you remember what language you're writing, HTML, you should be fine. So SVG, what I can do is just inline in my page, I can go and put in an SVG block. Now, it's not going to do much. But then what I can go and do is say, well, I want to have a circle, and I want the X at the center position to be 10, the center Y position to be, actually we'll make this 100, and we'll do a radius of 40. The presentation desks up here are great. They sort of build self-esteem because they make you feel really tall because you have to lean down to get to your laptop. So we've got a circle up there now. That's kind of simple. What more can we do with this? I can go and chuck a stroke on this. And I'm going to give it a green fill. Now, the next thing about this is because it's vector, I can go and zoom in on this in the browser. I can just go Control+, and it all goes and scales perfectly. If I use Windows+ to zoom in, you can see it's all being rendered nicely. Now, obviously, you're not going to go and write all your graphics in this way, but when you're working with a designer or somebody or doing it yourself, if you're working in something like Illustrator or Blend or any of those vector-based tools, they basically all have plugins to export to SVG. The standard's actually been around for a while. IE's been the one that's been holding up the adoption. So the next thing I'm going to do though then is we can get a little bit fancier here. I'm going to put a text block so again, just X and Y. So we've got that text showing up. Actually, let's put that inside the circle. No, but it's not. It's not working. Okay, the text gets to live outside. We'll move it down a bit so it overlaps. There we go. So we're putting some text into it. I can even actually go and put all HTML inside my SVG. So you can have HTML, SVG, HTML, SVG, and you can go and nest it all in line. Works pretty well. But so far all we've done is manage to put a circle on the page. Why do we actually care about this? Remember those new parsing rules I was talking about where every single tag has first-class support across all the systems? I've got a text tag down there. I can actually go and style this. So I can go and say, all right, well, the font size is 400%, and I'm going to put a text transform up on this to make all of the text uppercase. When I go and reload the page, there we go. The CSS is applied to it. So I'm now writing vector graphics and being able to style it with CSS. We can do even more than this. We're going to write some JavaScript against it, but I don't know how to write JavaScript because I just write jQuery. One of the tips with jQuery, don't go and hit this download jQuery button here. It just gives you the file. If you go to the download button on the menu at the top, scroll down, you'll see that one of the past, or a lot of the past releases have this Visual Studio documentation link next to them. You know when you're writing like C# code or whatever, you have the DLL and the XML file that triggers all the IntelliSense? The VS-Doc file is the equivalent of that for JavaScript. Now normally you have to have it side by side. Currently this is released as a separate release process to the jQuery releases, so there isn't always one for the current release of jQuery, but that's getting faster and faster and they're about to automate that, so that'll be all good. What I'm going to do here though is actually just right click on the minified one, copy the link address for that, and then back in Visual Studio, if I go script type, text JavaScript, put that source in. Now this is one of the big reasons that I use Visual Studio as my editor, even if I'm doing client-side stuff. I've just gone and referenced the minified jQuery file. It doesn't have any other extraneous stuff in it, so I can push this code straight to production. But side by side, Visual Studio has gone and downloaded the VS doc file for me automatically. I get full jQuery IntelliSense. So not really related to IE, but pretty powerful. So what I can do here now is I'm going to do a function when my document loads. And I'm going to go and find the text element that we have up here, so a standard jQuery selector, and I'm going to set the text of it to Hello New Zealand. Now, let's get out of Chrome. When I go and reload my page here, you can see the text is Hello New Zealand. So now we're doing vector graphics, we're styling them with CSS, and then we're actually scripting them with JavaScript as well. Start to think about stuff like if you've got graphs or rich visualizations in your applications, you don't want to go as far as a plugin experience like Silverlight. Using something like SVG, you can go and generate all this on the server because it's quite easy markup to generate. And then you can go and get all those nice scriptable experiences and whatnot. So, okay, the benefits of SVG. It's scalable because it's vector. It's scriptable because we've got first-class support for every single element. It's stylable, we saw that. It's also searchable because rather than having this binary stream of stuff, it's just a markup language, and we can go and embed HTML sections and whatnot in it. So particularly if you're going and rendering something like a graph, all of your various labels and axes and everything like that, search engines can actually go and pick it up. It's actually reasonably accessible as well, because the same as HTML, you've got a hierarchy to it, and you can actually navigate that through something like a screen reader. Obviously it's very visual though, it's not quite as accessible as true HTML, but there are extra little hints you can put on there to make areas of it focusable, so you can tab through the SVG, for example. And also it's actually seamless. So if you have a plugin experience, you can't really go and copy and paste that at all. If I right click on that bit of SVG, I get Save Picture As. I can highlight that section of the web page, copy it and paste it straight into a Word document. Try doing that with Silverlight or Flash in the middle of your page. Alright, so rather than writing code, let's have a look at some of the dev tools that are actually in there as well. In Internet Explorer 8, they introduced a bunch of them, and you trigger them by hitting F12. Now those same dev tools are still there, but they've added a bunch of new features. The first interesting one is that the DOM browser here, if I go and say select element, I can actually now go in and navigate in on stuff like my SVG. It has full support, again, for every single tag. And then I can go and do stuff like, if I want to go and change the fill there to yellow, I can just click in the attribute, type it, and press enter. So that's kind of useful. What is some of the stuff that's actually new though? If I go back to the home page, it's got the JavaScript profiler is now built in. So if I say start profiling, I go into psychedelic browsing, because this has a whole bunch of really nice for loops and stuff like that in it. We'll try and trigger some of those photo seizures again for anybody in the audience. Alright, so we've got a good 5 seconds of data there. Now if I go stop profiling, let's get out of that. This is very similar to running something like an ANTS profiler against your .NET code. I'll zoom in on it a bit. What we've got here is it's telling me the name of the function, how many times it was executed, how long that function took, and then where that function came from, which of my script files was it in, which line. I can then go and change this, though, into a call tree view. So now I can see that there's an anonymous function on line 819 of this file that was executed 457 times, and it took overall the most amount of time. And I can start to drill into that and see what actually killed the performance of my application. So as we start to do more sort of, one of the sites I worked on recently was a bidding site over in Australia. We had like 100 search results, and we'd use Ajax to go and constantly update all the live bid prices on those search results. And the performance just went through the floor. So we're able to use this profiler to actually understand what was the particularly slow points in our JavaScript, and we could go and optimize that. It turned out that basically the process of the way we were updating the elements, we were researching the entire DOM every time, and this profiler highlighted that. So once we cached that, we're all good. So that's pretty good. The other one, though, is then the network tracing. So particularly, obviously, Firebug is a tool that a lot of people use, and there's also Fiddler. Firebug's great because it's integrated straight into the browser. Fiddler's great because you can go and attach it to anything. I do a bit of work on mobile devices, and I can actually use Fiddler on my PC to do network tracing, sending the mobile device through the proxy and whatnot. Now we've also got the network tracing built into IE. So what this allows me to do, if I just say start capturing, I can go into one of these demos, stop capturing. While we're here, here's a nice example of hardware acceleration. We can go and increase the number of browser logos flying around. So what the network tracing's done there is just gone and found out which each of the resources that are loaded. It's giving us a timing graph off to the right here, so we can see when did it start loading them, how long did it take, time to first byte, all that sort of stuff. So we can see if we've got things like network blocking. If we jump into detailed view, we get information about all the request headers, request body, response, cookies, so on. One of the things that I really like about this, though, that you don't get in any of the other tools that I've tried, obviously Firebug being the main one, is the initiator. So this actually tells me what caused this resource to get requested. In this case here, it was that I clicked on a hyperlink, or it'll tell me the user pressed F5. So if you've got some of those weird caching issues and you're wondering, like, why is the browser reloading this file? It should be in the local cache. It'll tell you the decision that the browser made in order to go and trigger that request. And we can also go into the timings here, and we can see each of those components, and it goes and renders that on. It's actually quite a useful graph once you start to look at the details. And if you choose any of these different metrics, it gives a description down the bottom of what that metric is. But one of the things that I really like about Firebug is the YSlow integration. People familiar with YSlow? Reasonable number? Cool. So YSlow will go and take your page and analyze, based on all the network traffic and stuff, where your performance impacts are. Now, but you don't really want to be tying all your analysis to one browser, because you want to be able to run it across all the browsers. What's cool about this is there's, up the top corner here, there's actually a little save button. So I can go and export this traffic. And then if I go and open up something like Fiddler, I'm going to tell Fiddler not to capture my traffic. I can go import sessions, put in that path, and now those 4 requests that I had in Internet Explorer have been opened up in Fiddler for me, complete with all of the request body, all of the response body, and all of that timing data. So what we're also starting to see is a series of online services pop up where you can go and upload this format of data, which is a standardized format. You can go and upload that little XML file, and it will go and run all this analysis for you. So as we see more of the browsers adopt this standardized format, which they are, you'll be able to capture in one place and analyze elsewhere. So I can teletrace for the web. Now, that's all well and good, particularly the network timings, if you're actually in control of the browser. Obviously, though, a lot of us, we all run heaps of analytics on our pages. What are users clicking? Where are they clicking? Which links are they using? And so on. One of the big things, particularly in commerce sites where you're trying to get conversions, is actually the performance. It's very easy to prove that performance of a web page can significantly impact the bottom line of your sales. So how can we go and gather some more of this information? What I can actually do, I'm just going to create a new file actually. This is how you upgrade a document to HTML5. You take all that crap at the top and delete it. I'm just going to put in a script block here. And then world's simplest script, if I go alert window.msperformance.timing.dom complete. All right, if we open this in a browser, that gives me 0. But let's drill into this. If I open up the developer tools here, one of the other interesting tabs is the script tab. I can say start debugging. I can put a breakpoint on that alert line. If I go and reload that page, we get the same sort of debugging experience here that we get in something like Visual Studio. So I can actually hover over timing and expand that out. I'm doing this all in the browser. I haven't attached anything else. Under this timing object here, there's a whole series of different metrics that we can get. Those numbers are not in milliseconds, they're a date-time offset. So it's they're in milliseconds since the 1st of January 1970. So you actually know the absolute time that it started connecting to the server, did whatever DNS lookups it had to do, started fetching it, the first time it tried to paint. The navigation start is what triggered it, so that's the user clicking the hyperlink on like the previous page. We can see how long the unload event took on the previous page, all these different metrics. Now some of them are 0 because they either don't apply or they haven't had an effect yet. Stuff like response times don't apply if you're serving off the file system and so on. So what we can then start to do is in our client-side analytics script, and you can fully expect stuff like Google Analytics to start picking this up, is we can capture all of these timings and metrics from our users and actually start pushing all that data up so we can get a really good view of what's the actual end user experience. This is currently, you'll see there it's window.ms performance because it is currently a vendor-specific extension, so they prefix it with MS for Microsoft. Chrome are also working on a timing API, which they prefix with WebKit, so you've got WebKit performance. This has only been in the works for about the last 3 months now. They've both got to exactly the same API, so there's now actually a W3C web performance working group or something, which they're both co-chairing, and we are standard out for this literally in the next couple of months because they've basically done it all already, and then it will just become window.performance. Sorry. So if I jump back to one of the built-in demos, you can see window.ms performance here. If I just say I can add some work in the onload event, this here goes and generates out a graph of the page. So you can see it does have a whole bunch of really useful values. What are some of the ones we get out? We get all the navigation, if there's a redirect in place, how long do those previous requests take, response, request, response, DOM events, and so on. All right, so what does the browser look like in the wild? Obviously, there's a lot of people who, and this is kind of best practice, so I do it as well, write server-side code to go and detect the browser and sometimes react to it in slightly different ways. You will most likely have this in your applications. You'll most likely need to go and update it or make sure that your applications still work. The first one is the meta tag that a lot of us went and added when Internet Explorer 8 launched. How many people are familiar with this tag? Good number. All right. The 30-second example for people who aren't familiar with it. If I go and copy this page that I just built, if I go and open this in IE8, yes, oh, whatever. No, okay, and now I'm getting JavaScript errors. All right, yeah, not going to show that. Basically, you get the compatibility button up the top. If you put this meta tag in, it tells the browser, yes, I am standards compliant with IE8, if you do IE equals 8, and it removes the compatibility button. If you've done that on your site, you probably want to now update that to IE9 because you won't get all the features enabled if you're still running in IE8 compatibility mode. The other thing you can do, though, if you're working on, say, a team who your full-time job is maintaining some particular site, like, I don't know, you work on the cricket site that they launched in the keynote, and you know that you're always going to be testing your browser, instead of doing IE equals 9, right, IE equals edge. So that says I support whatever the latest version is. And then you won't have to go and update that tag, but you take on the responsibility for constantly testing your browser, testing your site. The other one is obviously changes in the user agent. The IE version changed, funny that. They also went and changed the Mozilla Compat version because they feel that this is now on par with Chrome 5, the Mozilla 5 code base, which is Firefox 4, and so on. So that in particular is one that's likely to trip up a lot of regular expressions and things that people have. So things like if you're doing browser version detection, a lot of people will write a regular expression, it finds the Mozilla 4.0, looks for MSIE, and then it pulls the version number out of it. Now, that's not going to work anymore because the start of your regex won't match. The other thing that's changed is Trident. Trident is the name of the rendering engine in Internet Explorer. So Trident is rendering, Chakra is the new JavaScript engine. Trident is now version 5.0 because of all the work they've been doing on all the CSS rendering. The other thing is this is what my IE8 user agent looked like. It leaks every bit of information about my computer you could possibly want. It tells you all the versions of .NET I have. It tells you I have Live Meeting 8 installed. I run on a media center. I have compact editions of .NET 4. SLCC2 is the service pack version. I've got all sorts of wonderful stuff. Basically, there's a registry key where anybody can put in extra registry values, and IE just shoves it through to the user agent. It's getting to the point where this was getting too long, and some of the server-side stuff was actually starting to reject the header. So IE9, they just stopped doing that. It's gone down, it's sending up my Windows version that I'm 64-bit, and that's it. Everything else is browser-specific. All right. How many people have used XHTML to the point that they've actually used this content type? One person, three people. All right. This content type's cool. You actually want to use it. What I'm actually going to do is fire up a new ASP.NET site really quickly, purely because it's the easiest way for me to go and affect all the various response headers. Okay, Visual Studio just disappeared. All right, so when we serve a page down to the browser, we send down a MIME content type. Typically for HTML, that is text/HTML. What the MIME type does is it tells the browser how to go and render or process this resource. So if we send down something like application/octet, it knows that it's a file download. If we send down application/PDF, it knows that it needs to go and load a PDF plugin, and so on. All right, so if I go and add a new page, all right, so I'm just going to leave all the XHTML 1.0 gumph at the top, and I'm going to say, hello there, Auckland, as soon as I can spell Auckland. Everybody see the mistake there? I didn't include the ampersand. All right, if I go and run up this page, Control F5, Chrome happily renders it. IE9 happily renders it. Now, if I go and put that into the W3C validator, I'm going to get an error. Now, as a developer, I obviously like to have my sites standards compliant. I get a lot of benefits from doing so. I don't think that's really a debate anymore. These sorts of mistakes are quite easy to let slip into the code, though, where people are copying out of Word documents or whatever. The other one is if I go and say, forget to close a div tag because I'm refactoring my page or something, once again, both of these browsers are quite happy to render that page without showing an error. But that's going to completely break my layout. You're going to have like the footer sitting in the sidebar and stuff like that, right? And that's one of those really hard to diagnose problems. I find that most of the issues that that we experience on development teams with standards compliance is actually these sorts of problems. It's not stuff like the attributes you're using and whatnot. So how can we catch these problems earlier? If I change the content type to application/XHTML plus XML, so I'm just doing this as an ASP.NET directive here, do this in your choice of server-side framework, and I go and reload this in Chrome, you can see what it's actually done is it's triggered an XML parser instead of the SGML parser. So the whole document has to be valid XML or boom, it blows up. Now you might not want to use this on your public site. Technically you're meant to for XHTML, but this means as soon as you get one error, the browser blows up. It's still useful though. In all the projects I work on, we have our sites configured to use this up until the end of the test phase. So all the way through to UAT, we'll run with XHTML content type, and then from staging up, we'll run with text/HTML. So this way here, in our development experience, we can find those issues really quickly. The problem with this is, if I go into something like IE8, and I go and open that page, because that content type isn't recognized, and it's just perpetually connecting, anyway, it will eventually pop up a download prompt, and it'll say like, hey, where do you want to save webform1.aspx? Obviously not how you users want to browse the web. So the key point out of all this is Internet Explorer 9 now supports that content type. What I'll actually do is I'll put a bit more markup in there. So Chrome, you'll see it displays the error at the top and it displays as much of the valid markup as it can. Internet Explorer 9, well, that's good. It's meant to crash, I swear. Okay. All right. It's like demo failure number 2. We're doing all right. In the current builds of IE9, I've obviously got something wrong there. In the current builds, they haven't written the code yet to display the error message. So basically it gets to the end of the valid markup, and as soon as it hits invalid stuff, it just gives up and stops rendering at that point. And you have no indication other than the rest of your page is missing. That will be finished by the RTM version. They just haven't done the UI around it yet. So anyway, something to explore in your development environment, even if you don't want to run that on your public sites. All right. We've got 10 minutes left. Let's have a quick look at imaging. A lot of nerds are into photography. I know I do a little bit of photography myself. I think it's kind of like diving. It's one of those technical things where we can sit there and fiddle around with f-stops and focus, zooms and all sorts of stuff. So if I jump into, here we go, color profiles. Let's pick on Chrome a little bit more, because that was the browser we chose earlier. Here we've got one photo that's been split up into 4 different images, and they have 4 different ICC color profiles embedded in them. Color profiles are what's used to describe how an image should be translated onto a screen in a way that's suitably realistic and matching the original intention of the photo. They're also used in things like print. In this case here, you can see Chrome doesn't support very many of them, so the image looks completely broken. If we do this in IE8, we get a similar experience. Actually, we get the same experience. If we do this in somewhere like Firefox, we get a different experience. In this case, the bottom 2 match and the top 2 are wrong. Can everybody guess what's going to happen in IE9? Hey, it all lines up perfectly. How much do people actually care about this? It's going to affect anywhere where you are doing stuff like uploading photos to Flickr and whatnot. They will display better. But even if you're working on something like just an e-commerce site, you want to have the best photos of your products you can. And the photographer that you're paying or your company is paying to take all those photos is probably providing them in a really high quality format. And then you may have had them before go and whinge of, oh, why do they look so flat on the website and stuff like that. And as developers, we kind of look at it and go, but what do you mean? That's red. And the photographer just disagrees with us. Now they're actually going to get a reliable rendering of their photo come through. All right, so let's get into a little bit more code. One of the big things on the web is obviously fonts. There's only like 6 fonts that we can use anywhere, and then we end up having little image headers everywhere. Or you have stuff like SIFR, which you embed a flash block and embedded font and all sorts of stuff to replace it, all kind of ugly. WOF is the Web Open Font Format. It's a way that we can go and use stuff like our corporate fonts and custom fonts in a design through on a web page. SVG does have a thing in it called SVG fonts, but none of the browser manufacturers have implemented it, and they all think it's a little bit stupid because you can only use it in SVG. WOF you can use through HTML or through SVG. So let's have a look at how it works. Back into Visual Studio, let's close our solution. Visual Studio is in hiding today. It just keeps disappearing. It's not even crashing. I prefer a crash because then I can test it, debug it. Okay, let's line it all up. All right, so what I've got here, fairly simple. I've got some text that says hello world. Open this up in a browser. Oh, just says hello. What I would usually go and do, anywhere using fonts on the web, is you'd go and say font family, and I'm going to try and use Whimsy first, but if the user doesn't have it, then we can go and use, let's use Wingdings. Let's get it. There we go. So in this case here, I obviously don't have Whimsy on my computer. So you've got all that fallback. But let's just go and define Whimsy. What I can do is I can do an @fontface directive, and then I just go and say a source. So I say from whimsy.wof, go and download this file, and we'll call it Whimsy. Now when I go and reload it, I get that custom font coming through. So where does that come from? In the folder next to where I've been writing this demo, I have whimsy.waf, is just one of these font formats. There's a whole bunch of online libraries where you can go and browse all these fonts, download them now. Typekit is a really good one because you basically pay a subscription and then you can use any of the fonts in their library. You can direct link to their CDN and they take care of all the licensing for you. But particularly if you have a corporate font or something like that, this becomes quite a practical way of doing it. Now, because of the way this extends CSS, so we never actually touched the div rule, all we did is add an extra rule to define this font. If we go and open this up in another browser, say IE8, then we just get the font fallback scenario, which is exactly what we normally experience anyway. Particularly if you look at a site like iinet.net.au, one of the ISPs over in Australia, they have really nice headings on each of their sections, and if you don't have the font available, it just falls back. So the site's still functional, it still looks okay, it's just not exactly to their corporate guidelines. There's a few restrictions around the way the fonts work. You have to load them from, there's certain domain name restrictions and stuff like that. So you can't just go and point off to some arbitrary URL. So that is basically the browser protecting you from users or other developers just stealing your font and making you host it and so on. So there's some things to be aware of around that if you are going to go and develop against it. So that's Internet Explorer 9. We've talked about HTML5 a bit. We've looked at CSS3. We've looked through SVG. We've looked at the developer tools. Basically, this is all out there now. Everything I've shown today is all public. You can go and download these bits. You can go and use them. The beta is going to ship on the 15th of September, and that's when we're going to see what the consumer experience looks like. So we'll see what all the address bars and all that sort of stuff is. If you want to grab any of the resources for this talk or get in contact with me for any questions or anything, all my contact details are up on that URL there. And thank you very much. I'll be here for a bit if anyone's got any questions now.